Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 21st of July, and we have a lot more confirmation of developments I've been talking about for the past couple of days regarding Pokrovsk. We have Russian DRG infiltrations that have gotten really deep into the city of Pokrovsk. We're going to look at those developments first and foremost, along with many other advances, including along the Zaporozhye front and also Bilohora just to the east of Toretsk. So as we get into the video, please like and subscribe and join the channel if you're interested. So let's zoom in over here on this developing story with Pokrovsk. So we're going to begin with what's certainly under Russian control, and you can see it marked with these yellow polygons. And this is just the bare minimum based on reporting from Ukrainian side, like Petrenko, and also geolocations that we've seen come out in recent hours. So first of all, just north of this town of Shevchenko, the Russian forces have been able to solidify control over the anti-tank ditch. They've been able to seep themselves into this hedgerow, this forest line, and also this street called Zaliznichia. It's a bit isolated, but there are a couple of houses over here that were contested. Now it's all fallen into Russian hands. You also have this section of the rail line that's very close to Solonenki River that's been taken over. It amounts to 31 hectares, and this other polygon is nearly 1.5 square kilometers in size. So a lot of these regions that were either a gray zone or under Ukrainian control are now falling into Russian hands. The Ukrainians are simply too stretched out over here. They were unable to retain control over forward positions that are too far away from the main garrisons located in the heart of Pokrovsk. And the routes in and out of these forward positions were becoming increasingly difficult to pass through because the Russian forces on the ground are making it very difficult. They are conducting ambushes using DRG units to target Ukrainian forces from the rear. And when I refer to the rear, I'm talking about this area over here. It's really turned into an active region where a lot of small Russian squads between 3 to 4 men are operating. So any potential Ukrainian presence that was south of these open fields was within the really danger zone, you could call it. They were within the Russian purview and could have been cut off, could have been targeted from the rear. And so they were squeezed out as a result. And now a lot of the areas that were previously in the gray zone are being corrected. So the Russians have a solid base to build up and attack further northwards towards more populated areas on the southern outskirts of the city and also the southern districts within the actual city confines. So now, based on this movement along these two adjacent windbreaks, we can also see that the Russians are getting very close to pushing the Ukrainians out of all their nearby positions over here, including Novokrainka. And that would remove all of the leverage Ukraine has, all of these very important defensive points that used to be acting as anchors that prevented the Russian forces from breaking through and arriving at the actual city limits. So now they're able to reach those city limits, as we'll get to in a moment. But you can see how some of the final defenses that are perhaps a bit further south of the city that did play a big role in delaying the inevitable. They're about 3 kilometers, 2.5 kilometers away from these southern districts. Now they are really within the Russian purview, as we've been saying for numerous other locations. They are dangerous because there is a southern flank that is active and also a western flank. But the primary sector where we're seeing Russian activity is a bit further northwestwards. We can see over here the Russian forces have captured 0.94 square kilometers of territory in Zvirove. Here's a geolocation from July 21st of Russian forces as they were filmed moving east. There were two of them in the video, and it's very close to Terrakon number 20. That's what it's called. And so it's certainly not under Ukrainian control anymore. And the Russians can begin using it at this point because their RGs have already infiltrated into this area and have taken over solid control nearby. That will give them an opportunity to overlook whatever Ukrainian forces, whatever vestiges of their defensive components are still operating in the low-lying valley of Leontovichi. This area is rather low-lying. Pokrovsk itself, the heartland of the city, is on extremely high elevation, some of the highest topography in the entire region. But this ring over here that runs along the local ponds is on lower elevation, running along a local valley. You can see over here, I think that's pond number 5, this one, and it's just numbered in chronological order like that. So all of those pawns are now falling into what we can refer to as a gray zone. Leontivici may also be within that gray zone at this point, but I just haven't received enough confirmation to make that change. It seems as if the Ukrainians are trying to resist over here because this acts as a buffer and a stopgap that would prevent a unification between two different vectors of Russian attack. One vector would be directly attacking from the south and pushing towards an area like Troyanda, and then from there into the really important core of the city. So that's one vector that's extremely dangerous, and we'll get to it in a moment. And the other one is from Pischane, because we saw how the Russians have recently been able to take back the entire perimeter of the town of Pischane. And then from there, branch out into Zhirove, and then the other route would be to Lentovici. From there, they would run along Volitsia Zotova into the E50 highway area and link up with the forces to the east. And that's why it's so important for the Ukrainians to, at least for the time being, create this buffer zone that spans about 1.5 kilometers. But the viability of it is really, really untenable when you think about it, because the Russian forces already have the momentum from the southwest, and DRGs are running amok and have not been contained to the east. So it's going to be very easy for the Russians to find weak points and squeeze the Ukrainians out of this area, which is why I'm not confident about the Ukrainians being able to contain what's going on over here. I think it's only going to continue blossoming this sort of explosion in Russian activity that's getting dangerously close to a lot of very important Ukrainian positions that previously could have been considered on the rear. They were pretty far away from the front line. But you can see this is a great example, a video from today actually, that was published on Ukrainian channels of a car, a private vehicle that the Ukrainians were driving on along the E50 highway. I think this section of the highway is actually within the city, so it's called Defenders of Ukraine Street. So it's the main demarcating road in southern Pokrovsk. You have another one a bit to the north that runs through Murad as well, and it's basically a part of the T0504 highway. But this one is also very important for connectivity across the entirety of the city, spanning from the southeast to the northwest. So you can see that Russian DRGs, by the end of the video, were firing on those Ukrainian forces from close range, and that to get out of their cars and seek refuge. This indicates to us that Russian forces, these DRGs, are already present in this forested area that is very close to the road. And that means that using this street over here is becoming really dangerous. So even though this part of the front line nominally looks like it is very outstretched and very disconnected from where the Russian line of contact is on my map, the real situation is much more difficult on the ground. We just can't say for sure which fields, which trenches, which sections of the houses over here have fallen into Russian hands or remain ambiguous. So that's why I'm leaving a lot of room for this gray zone over here, which is neither marked in red or in blue. And you can see it over here that there are potential routes the Russians could have taken, one of which could be through Zhirova potentially. Perhaps the Russian DRGs have already broken through and are using this route to move northwards, cross near Terrakan number 21, and from there near Troyanda and enter into this local forested area. This local forested region is very close to the Jubilee Park, which is an area where in my last video we talked about reports of Russian DRGs infiltrating in the past. So it seems like those reports are now more credible. And the genesis of this information was all from July 18th. That's when all of this information started to circulate on Ukrainian channels. So what happened on that day? Apparently, a Ukrainian brigade ran out of infantry along this part of the front line. This is what Deep State is reporting. And this led to a crisis. It led to the Russians taking advantage of that void, and they were able to seep into a lot of rear positions as a result. So the Ukrainians quickly scrambled elements of the 155th Mechanized Brigade and 68th Jaeger Brigade to operate in this region and try to quell these DRG assaults. They were able to stop some of them and kill some of them. They showed proof of that, actually. But they even admit, Deep State themselves, that as of today, a large chunk of those DRGs are still present near the city and are able to cause a lot of chaos, because the Ukrainians, they are aware of the fact that DRGs are really close to them and the threat looms if they are operating in southern Pokrovsk, but they don't know the routes the DRGs are using. So there is still that secrecy that the Ukrainians have been unable to decode about their routes. And we don't even know their exact routes. I was speculating that it could be from Zhirove, It could also be directly from Shevchenko and then crossing near Terrakan 21, then Troyanda, and then from there pushing like this. We also know that there is another layer of DRG activity a bit to the east. So there are reports of these Russian forces entering into the Zelenivka residential area. So it would be this location over here. I still have it marked in blue because the information is still in its infancy. I would say we need to wait for more corroboration, but it's certainly possible that the Russians advanced along this paved road, made it to the what is it called, Zelenivka district, and then from there, there are a lot of other micro districts that are just naturally connected to one another that could all fall in quick succession, and that is certainly a concern. So I'll just list them out for you guys so you get an idea of the areas that we're talking about, and I'll give them a name. So you have the Parkovi microdistrict, which is located over here. This is just a general demarcation based on map carta. That's where I got the names from. You can see it over here. You also have the Lazurny microdistrict a bit to the north. And these regions, like Lazurny, they are really consisting of a lot of high rise buildings, condos in certain cases, duplexes, whatever they may be. So those are really important defense nodes. If the front line wasn't so lopsided in the sense that the Russian forces are already putting pressure from the western flank, then this would make a really important defensive node that can be defended for a very long time, similar actually to the citadel that defended in western Bakhmut. But because this western flank is already becoming compromised, I just simply can't see how the Ukrainians are able to maximize the defensive potential of these areas. I think that they're going to be infiltrated rather quickly and overrun in certain locations. I think that if it's true that one of the brigades that was defending over here did have such an acute shortage that it completely ran out of frontline manpower, then that certainly means that other units have to pick up the slack, and that means they're also attrited at higher rates. So just to get back to that for a moment, because I do want to mention this, the 68th Brigade and 155th, they're apparently doing the heavy lifting over here when it comes to defense. So which brigade ran out of manpower? I'm trying to think, and I can't say for sure, but it potentially is the 32nd Mechanized Brigade, another one of these units that is generally operating around here. Previously, they were very active around Udachny, and they were one of the main units at the forefront of repelling the Russian attacks over there. Same with Kotlina. So it's possible that due to the fact that over the past year and a half, or half year rather, they have been very active on the front line, including in areas that are not urban in nature, but they are settlements. So a lot of these Ukrainian units have not engaged that much in close quarters combat. More so, they're reliant on drone crews that are doing most of the work throughout the day. But this brigade in particular has been involved in a lot of close quarters combat that could have led to a lot of casualties within their ranks. And if they didn't have time to replenish, then certainly it's possible that they are the specific unit that depleted their forces and was no longer able to hold on to their sector of responsibility. As recently they were moved a bit to the east to defend near Bischana, and that's the exact area where the Russians recently broke through. So that's just my own theorizing. I don't have any sources backing that up, but it would make sense. But to get back to what I was referring to, you also have the Sonyachny district. You can't even see it on Google Maps, but it is also located generally over here. The most prominent one that you see on the map is the Shakhtarsky microdistrict because it consists of the most apartment complexes and they are the tallest. They have the most stories, and I would assume they also have a lot of basements, very hardened structures. Some of them are Khrushchevkas, I would believe. So it's actually similar to Vuhledar in terms of the architecture. So on their own in isolation, these actually are very good defensive nodes. And you have over here a local stadium, you have a hospital, you have this post office. So there are just a lot of buildings that can be utilized for that sort of defense. But that's why the Russians understood that they cannot just attack these areas head on. And they sent in DRGs once they noticed the Ukrainian weakness and pushed in the area that is most exposed, which would be this opening between Leontivici and the Zelenivka microdistrict around here. So that's the gap that the Russians use to exploit, I believe. And that also means that Troyanda is currently in a gray zone for the most part. And as long as the Russians aren't repelled in these regions, they're going to turn it into a stronghold. They're going to send in reinforcements eventually once they become comfortable over here. And then from there, you will see a lot of direct maneuvers to take over Shakhtarsky. And that would give the Russians a really good opportunity to overlook the rest of the city, because we talked about how Pokrovsk is on high elevation. The Russians don't have any nearby locations that are on parity. The only place that I could think of would be a Terrakon, and those Terrakons are located a bit to the north, or rather northeast. You can see them over here, like the one that is referred to as the Krasno-Limanskaya Terrakon and mine, and then you also have this one just to the west of Novoekonomichny. But this is a bit farther away, and it's more so connected to Myrnograd. And when we're looking at the immediate vicinity of Pokrovsk, the best outlet for establishing topographic parity would be through taking over some of these high rises, and then from there firing towards the private residential areas that are located in the center of the city. Also in the center, you do have a couple of other districts that are high rises that contain a lot of these high rises. So to be fair, you have the what is it referred to? The Sobochovka district, and that's located in this eastern parts of the city over here. And this is an area that is a bit more suburban in nature. You know, it's a bit more stretched out. Each house has its own garden. Then to the west, you have the Pervomaika district over here. Again, very similar. I don't know what the one in between them is called, but this is certainly going to be an area the Russians wants to nullify. They want to nullify Ukraine's offensive abilities over here, because they do contain a lot of apartment buildings as well. So that's a bit of a breakdown of the city of Pokrovsk itself. But I can already tell you guys that DRGs are operating very close to the main road, the E50 highway. And you could see how, just to compare that to the distance from the current front line, it's about 4 kilometers. 4 kilometers is no joke near an urban area that should be so dense in terms of infantry, because the entire point is that this is ground zero, and this is an area where infantry brigades are especially needed in order to prevent these sort of breakthroughs and openings from happening. So you'd expect that, and you also expect for drone crews to be very active, picking off these Russian soldiers, and they are, but they can't stop all of it. That's why I was saying that drones and drone units cannot properly replace the manpower needed to defend certain strong points. It can't do it sufficiently for a drawn out period of time. Although it is very helpful and certainly does lead to further attrition of Russian forces, it can never completely halt those sort of movements. And that's what we're seeing over here. That one of these infantry brigades was unable to hold on. Their drone crews were not enough. They were not sufficient. And now the infantry from other units are coming in to try to potentially reduce the blowback as a result. So we're going to keep a very keen eye on what we're going to see develop over here south of the city, and actually very close to the center of the city in certain regards. And just to zoom out, I do want to show you guys some of the routes that I've been drawing over here, the escape routes from the city. So this will be important in giving us an idea for how long the Ukrainians can truly defend in the city of Pokrovsk, because I'm not confident about their ability over here. Whereas in areas like Bakhmut, the flanks were much more rigid in defense. You didn't have these sort of DRG infiltrations. They were much more dense and concentrated. You didn't have as many open areas in between that can be exploited. This is a difference. The infantry over here is much more lacking than it was during that period of time in Bakhmut, and also in Avdiivka to a certain degree. In Avdiivka, the main issue wasn't necessarily the manpower. There were actually a lot of troops deployed. It was, first of all, the way in which the Russians were flanking the city, but also the fact that the Ukrainians lacked artillery during that time period. That was a huge sticking point in February of 2024. Now we're in July 2025, and the dynamics are a bit different. FPV crews are very active around here and did a really impressive job in holding back the Russians a bit to the east of the city of Myrnograd for a while, but their deficiencies were exposed, as we were talking about. And now we have the situation where the Russians are only, let's see, about 4.7 kilometers away from reaching one of the key routes that supplies Pokrovsk and is able to connect it to the wider rear. So you can see how this one over here, this road that I marked in orange, it's the Pokrovsk Dobropilia route, one of the most important ones, but it's also very close to the current Russian line of contact. There are a couple of other local routes that sort of extend out of a junction over here to the west of Rodinska. And this is a part of why Rodinska is so important, why the Ukrainians are going to try to defend over here with all of their wherewithal, because the fall of Rodinska would naturally mean that this junction to the west also falls. And then a couple of road networks would be cut off. For instance, this one that runs through Shevchenko and connects to another Dobropilia. And then from there, it could branch out to this other village, Krivovrizhia, whatever. I hate pronouncing it. And then from Dobropilia Minor to Dobropilia Major to the north. You also have this route over here a bit to the south that acts as an agricultural local road, you could say. And it acts as a conduit between the Rodinska region and the chain of villages that runs from Hryshny all the way to Yurivka, Petrivska, Kamyanka, and then eventually the border with Dnipro. So that's another important escape route. Then you have Hryshny itself, which has its own routes that we can look at. They are more so local routes, but they are paved. So you can see, for instance, running along Krishna itself, you have route to Dobropilia. You also have one extending towards the same chain of villages that we talked about. It's on Lenina Street, as it's referred to. And then you have this one other appendage from Rishne to the E50 highway that connects to it. And speaking of the E50 highway, this is the E50 highway over here marked on the map. You can see how, first of all, in the deeper parts of the salient of Pokrovsk, it's already becoming untenable for the Ukrainians to use this road because of how close it is to DRG activity. But in areas that are a bit to the north, it's still a reliable, more or less road. You're not going to get much better than it over here unless you're using the open routes or the local roads. And this is all relative because the E50 highway is about 5 kilometers away from the front line over here. It definitely is within Russia's objectives in the near future to cut it off, either physically or just by getting very close, like the DRGs did, and firing on it directly. So, what I was saying is that the highway extends from the outer ring of Pokrovsk and then does move to the northwest all the way to Andronivka, and that's on the border with Dnipro. So, this is how it connects to an area like basically this entire line. This is actually a really important line of villages that has not been mentioned much. It runs along Slovyanka and all the way to a bunch of other nodes in Dnipro, eventually to Pavlograd. That was my point. This is a really massive city, really important rear base for the Ukrainians that sort of connects to the entire part of the front line that's currently heated, whether it be near the Dnipro border or Pokrovsk and Mirnorod. And a bit closer to home would be Mezheva over here, which is also in a roundabout way connected to the front line because you would advance along this highway and then take a right turn and then from there make it to the E50 highway. So that's just a crash course on the logistics over here. They are very compromised, and that's why I'm not confident about Ukraine's ability to defend over here long term. We'll see if I'm proven wrong on that, but it's just a heuristic based on the location of these roads and the pace at which the Russians have been approaching them. And we do have to note that due to the Russians conducting these deep breakthroughs with DRGs on the southern part of the town, it means that those troops the Ukrainians could have otherwise sent to defend to the northeast will be contained. They will remain pinned down in this particular location, whether they be from higher caliber units like the 68th Jaeger Brigade or other ones like that we talked about before, like the 25th Airborne, like the 2nd Battalion of the 15th National Guard Brigade, like the 23rd Special Purpose Battalion, like the 3rd Spartan Brigade, like the 152nd Jaeger Brigade. All of these units that are generally floating around here, they will be pinned down operating south of Pokrovsk rather than defending against other Russian breakthroughs occurring to the northeast that will lead to cutting off of key routes to Mirnorod and could actually lead to the entrance into the city of Mirnorod. So this is a part of Russia's broader strategy of stretching the Ukrainians thin across multiple weak points and then exploiting the one that is the weakest. So that's an explanation of the current developments in Pokrovsk. Hopefully that was useful. And let's zoom in on other developments from today. So first of all, the Russian forces were able to enter into Poltavka and take over the majority of it. You can see this is a capture of 2.1 square kilometers of territory. A video from the 117th Battalion of the 111th TDF Brigade was released showing FPV strikes and grenade drops onto Russian soldiers as they were entering into houses and dugouts in this town. And this means the Russians are awfully close to taking over the entirety of this anti-tank ditch that is not manned at all at this point. The only sort of Ukrainian presence would be perhaps in Rusin Yar. So that's going to be another objective for the Russian forces in the near future. And the drone crews are doing most of the heavy lifting and trying to drag out the Russian effort at offensive activities and also trying to attrit them as much as possible. The issue is with the fall of Rusin Yar, you would have this massive, large chunk of territory open for the taking by the Russian side, running along this huge ridge. You can see it over here. I'm marking it in red. This ridge overlooks the chain of villages that run along this valley, connecting to Alexandro Druskivka, for instance, running along again that same network of villages out of Konstantinivka, connecting to Druskivka. So Essentially, the fall of Rusin Yar would unlock a lot of opportunities for the Russians going into the latter portions of 2025. I think this is why the Russians will actually exploit this area. They may not exploit the area a bit to the west near Volodymyrivka just yet because it is a bit more peripheral. But I do think the Russians do sense there's an opportunity over here, and taking over this large chunk of territory would put enormous strain on Konstantinivka eventually, and would help with the buildup that is currently going on, the concerted effort between the Yablonivka and Turецk fronts to close a lot of salients and eventually focus all their efforts together combined onto Konstantinivka. I think that could be aided and abetted with advances a bit to the southwest of Konstantinivka through this open area. And it would also have a lot of strain on the Volodymyrivka Raiske line, which then again has its own connections to an area like Dobropilia. And from there, if we're looking really big picture, the highway between Dobropili and Kramatorsk. So you can see how everything is interconnected. And a lot of it begins through this ridge over here. It is really large. It is a really important area that the Ukrainians so far could have used as a forward position for spying on the Russian side, looking at their movements, firing mortar rounds, firing artillery howitzers from a bit farther back. So yeah, that's definitely going to be a very important asset for the Russians to take over moving forward. And final thing, I would say that the Russians advanced about 1.3 kilometers northwards through Poltavka. Let's look at developments that I forgot to mention in yesterday's video. So west of Kotlyarivka, the Russians captured 2.7 square kilometers of territory. Here you can see there is an effort. It's not the most important Russian maneuver right now, but nonetheless, it is being undertaken. There is a Russian effort to broaden the extent of their control along the border with Dnipro, and that will provide them with a solid base to launch attacks directly towards Novopavlivka, pretty close to the Solona River. And for that to be achieved, they would also have to take over the rest of Novomikhailovka and Muravka. So keep an eye out for that. Let's look at the advance that occurred in Zaporozhye for a moment. So you can zoom in over here and see that the Russian forces were able to enter into eastern Malotokmachka. We all remember this area from the counteroffensive in 2023. Can't believe it's been more than 2 years since then. But you can see that zero point 0.6 square kilometers of territory was taken over in this recent Russian endeavor, led by the 70th Motor Rifle Regiment. They employed 3 armored vehicles and attacked and were able to infiltrate this amount of forces in the eastern part of the settlement, very close to the Konka River, actually. And from there, they engaged in a lot of suppressive fire, including with higher yield FPV drones with larger payloads, and also artillery strikes targeting individual houses. And from there, infantry made their way and entered into a lot of houses. So this assault, at least its initial efforts at anchoring itself in the town, has been successful. And now it's just a matter of expanding that, continuing to advance along this narrow corridor and taking over the entirety of Molotokmachka, because then you would see a lot of pressure, frankly, from the north onto this salient to the south. The salient that is completely consisting of open fields, but it does contain a lot of dugouts, a lot of really well prepared defenses as a result of just years of this area being dangerous, and the forces over here, whether they be Russian or Ukrainian, having no choice but to dig in. So a lot of that can be exploited, but the Russian forces can sort of circumvent that direct attack on that defensive area to the south that is also very close to Robotyne, and attack Malotokmachka directly. And that would create a lot of pressure from the north and would also set the stage for an attack on Orkiv, although that is still, as I said numerous times, really far out, and it's not a main Russian concern right now. Looking over here, Oleksivka, the Russian forces captured 4.2 square kilometers of territory, meaning that the entirety of the village has fallen into Russian hands, once again chipping away at the salient that is now becoming more and more small, less of a threat to the Russian side, less of a thorn in their back as the front lines begin to correct. So, in terms of the advance westwards, you can see that it amounts to 4.4 kilometers. And the Russians are now in the process of taking over the remaining heights north of the Vavcha River, the remaining dugouts, remaining really well fortified trenches. So the Ukrainians and their air assault battalions are resisting over here. But with this new development, with this new advance, it's going to be very much more difficult for the Ukrainians to continue with their defensive efforts, because they'll have nowhere to really base themselves out of. It's just these few trenches near the border with Dnipro and a whole host of open fields and tree lines. So once that closes in on itself, there will be a significant opportunity for the Russian forces to begin pushing westwards and cross over the border 6 kilometers towards the highway that is connecting to Novopavlivka. Because very clearly the Ukrainians have made an emphasis and have been able to counterattack directly south of the city. So we'll have to see if they're able to contain that advance to the south. At the same time, that in parallel, they're trying to defend against attacks that are really going up along a very broad parts of the eastern flank. That will be a good test for us to determine whether there is defensive solidity for the Ukrainian garrison in Novopavlivka. Now, to move on to Turetsk, I want to zoom in on here and then look at Sumy. So you can see the Russian forces were able to achieve a really deep advance, capturing the entirety of Bilohora. This amounts to 5.88 square kilometers of territory. We have two videos backing up this advance. One of them coming from the Black Raven drone group. It's a part of the 93rd Mechanized Brigade, so they conducted FPV and grenade drops onto Russian soldiers in dugouts. So they likely advanced from two vectors. I would say one coming from the east over here, running along this paved road and taking over the full width of Bilohora, and then one from Delivka, because the Russians are very present over here. A lot of their assault units are operating over here in Delivka, so they can just naturally extend their control along this paved routes and make it to the western outskirts of Bilohora, which now indicates that the entirety of the settlement is under Russian control. We have this video from July 21st of Rudenko where they claimed the Russian forces had captured Bilohora, and they filmed soldiers walking through the nearby houses. What this means is that there's once again a salient forming, one between the smaller Delivka and the rail station that is accompanying it, and a bit to the east, the larger Dolivka. So this open region in between is now under a lot of strain. It could potentially close as a result, and that would give the Russians a very strong salient. You can see how it would be very difficult to undermine it from the flanks, and it would give it the necessary momentum to push along this paved route and arrive at Konstantinivka directly. Because besides one final settlement, this one over here, Alexandru Shultine, there are no other populated areas in between that can separate the Russians from arriving at the southeastern outskirts of the city. You do have this garden region, and it does contain a couple of dachas, so that will be the first on the chopping block for the Russians, and that's what they will encounter first. And so that will be the new status quo for where the fighting reaches, and certainly that's not going to be comfortable for the Ukrainians, because it means that Konstantinivka will only be a couple of kilometers away from the main center of fighting. So artillery units will be moved across the Donbass Canal as a result. And another fear would be that it connects the Russian garrison over here in Bilohora, eventually connects with the one in Stupochki, and then they would be able to coordinate much more efficiently across the canal and undermine the city from multiple axes. So that's just a bit of a look at the future in that part of the front line. I think it will be a defining moment, a really defining battle throughout the latter portions of this year. But let's finish off with Sumy, because something I've talked about for a while is now actually coming into fruition. The Russian forces that took Yablonivka are now pushing westwards and took over allegedly Verachny. I can't say for sure that they took over the entirety of it, but I do know that the 83rd Air Assault Brigade, they raised their flag in the eastern part of this village, and this is from today. It was released on Russian media, the video. And 83rd Brigade, we talked about how they may have been rotated out. It appears that either of those reports were false, and I read that from Russian sources, but maybe it was incorrect, or simply they were reintroduced to the fighting once it became evident that the Ukrainians were taking advantage of the rotations and conducting counterattacks. So now the 83rd Brigade is back, and it is a very combat capable unit. So are some of the other Russian forces operating around here, like the 155th Naval Infantry Brigade, and same goes for the 40th and 177th brigades and regiments, respectively. The lower caliber units over here would be the territorial motor rifle regiments, but they are a minority of units in this region. For the most part, they are elements from the VDV or Marines, so they have been doing most of the heavy lifting recently, and they're continuing to do so because in the areas where they've been replaced to a certain degree, the Ukrainians have taken advantage of that and have been able to push back the Russians. So now you can see how the Russian push over here is aimed at once and for all closing the salient that includes Verashny and Novomikhailovka, because this region acts as a thorn in Russia's back that denies any sort of continuity between the main Russian force that is operating in the eastern part of this I would refer to it as the Sumy bridgehead. And then the western bridgehead, which is far smaller, can't really connect to it on an immediate basis because there is this massive obstacle in between. So I do believe the Russians are going to try to offset the recent losses in Andreevka and Kinrativka by closing this salient once and for all. We'll see if they're successful, but they've been able to make inroads so far by capturing 2.4 square kilometers of territory and pushing, let's see how much westwards, about 1.6 kilometers. So that's in summary. That's a summary for the 21st of July. We're going to keep a close eye on what's going on in Pokrovsk. And thank you all for watching. Once again, if you're interested, become a member. I'm doing once a week really interesting uploads based on what members recommend to me. So I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.